The summer heat pressed down on the mourners gathered at Oakwood Cemetery as the honor guard raised their rifles for the final salute. Three sharp cracks split the air, making several people flinch. The sound echoed off the surrounding oak trees before fading into a heavy silence. General Kendall Holloway stood perfectly still, her dress uniform crisp despite the humidity. Sunlight caught the rows of medals on her chest, each one earned through years of dedicated service. Her hands gripped the precisely folded American flag, its triangular shape a sacred geometry of loss and honor. From her position near the casket, she could see every face in the crowd. Some wore grief openly, others maintained military bearing, but all eyes followed her movement. All except Officer Marcus Tate, who stood at the edge of the police line with his lips pressed into a thin white line. His gaze burned with barely contained hostility as he watched a black woman command such respect and authority. Marjorie Holloway sat in the front row, her back straight despite the weight of her grief. Her hands were folded in her lap, steady and dignified, even as tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. The widow's strength seemed to magnify the significance of this moment. General Holloway took one measured step toward Marjorie, then another. The flag felt both light and impossibly heavy in her hands. Each step carried the weight of protocol, of duty, of a debt long overdue. Hold it right there. Tate's voice cracked through the sanctity like a whip. He broke formation, shoving his way through the crowd with his baton extended. Everyone back, clear the area. Mourners stumbled backward, confusion and alarm rippling through their ranks. The sacred atmosphere shattered as Tate continued forcing people away from the casket. Sergeant Luis Navarro, a young veteran in dress uniform, stepped forward with his palms raised. "Officer, please," he said quietly, trying to de-escalate. "This is a military funeral. Let's show some respect." "Back off!" Tate snarled, ramming his baton into Navarro's chest. The ceremonial program Navarro had been holding fluttered to the ground, landing in the freshly turned earth beside the grave. "There's a threat situation. Clear the area now." General Holloway remained motionless, her military training taking over as she assessed the situation with combat-honed precision. Her eyes marked potential escape routes, tracked the positions of other officers, noted which mourners might need protection if things escalated further. Without any obvious movement, she shifted her stance to place herself between Marjorie and Tate. The crowd's grief transformed into fear as people began to realize what was happening. Parents pulled children closer. Elderly mourners stumbled backward, some nearly falling as they tried to retreat from the threat. Combat-hardened veterans moved with practiced precision, positioning themselves to shield civilians while maintaining sight lines on the armed officer. "I said clear the area," Tate shouted again, his face reddening as his orders failed to produce the panic he seemed to want. His right hand dropped to his holster, fingers drumming against the leather. The crowd gasped and recoiled. More phones rose into the air, their lenses capturing every moment. The click of camera shutters provided a stark counterpoint to the rough sound of Tate's breathing. Through it all, General Holloway maintained her bearing. Decades of discipline held her in place. Her mind cataloged details with tactical precision. Tate's aggressive stance, the position of other officers who hadn't joined his charge, the growing number of witnesses with cameras, the trembling of Marjorie's shoulders as she fought to maintain her composure. The sacred space around Raymond Holloway's casket had become a battlefield of a different sort. The final tribute to a fallen soldier transformed into a tense standoff with a decorated general at its center, still holding the flag that represented everything this moment was meant to honor. Phones continued recording as Tate's fingers wrapped around his holster, the leather creaking audibly in the charged silence. The tension shattered as Tate slowly lowered his weapon, his movements stiff with reluctance. Marshal Elaine Sutter stepped smoothly between him and General Holloway, her stance protective but professional. Around them, the funeral gathering dissolved into a wave of shaken whispers and stifled sobs. "Hand over your service weapon, Officer Tate," Sutter commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. She held out her hand expectantly. Tate's lip curled into a sneer. "You don't have the authority." Marshal Sutter cut him off, flashing her credentials. "I absolutely do have the authority. Your weapon now." The crowd watched in tense silence as Tate unholstered his pistol, making a show of careful handling that couldn't quite hide his contempt. He placed it in Sutter's waiting hand with exaggerated care. The response was immediate and divided. Cheers erupted from one section of the gathering, while hard glares and muttered threats came from another. The invisible line splitting the cemetery seemed to mirror the town's deeper divisions. General Holloway turned her attention back to Marjorie, who swayed slightly on her feet. She steadied the widow with a gentle hand, her touch conveying strength and respect. "Mrs. Holloway," Kendall said softly, "may I present this flag on behalf of a grateful nation in recognition of your husband's faithful and dedicated service." Her voice carried the weight of ceremony, though her hands trembled slightly as she completed the precise folds and transfers that tradition demanded. Marjorie accepted the flag, pressing it close to her heart. Tears streamed down her face, but she held her head high, refusing to let the ugly incident overshadow her husband's honor. Kendall stepped back and delivered a crisp salute to Raymond's casket, holding it with parade ground precision. The remaining honor guard followed suit, their synchronized movements restoring a measure of dignity to the proceedings. As the service concluded, reporters materialized like vultures, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Chief Wallace Keene arrived, his face arranged in a mask of official concern. "This unfortunate incident will be thoroughly investigated," Keene announced to the press, his voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. "Officer Tate is suspended pending review of all relevant facts." Behind the cameras, Keene placed a reassuring hand on Tate's shoulder, exchanging a look that spoke volumes about the true nature of the investigation to come. Later, in the quiet of Marjorie's living room, Kendall sat across from the widow, both women's faces lined with exhaustion. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through lace curtains as Marjorie pulled out a worn manila folder. "They never wanted to give him his due," Marjorie said, her voice thick with decades of frustration. "This so-called disciplinary record followed him everywhere." She pushed the folder across the coffee table. Kendall opened it carefully, scanning yellowed pages that reeked of calculated character assassination. "This is why his honors were blocked." Marjorie nodded, twisting her wedding ring. "Every time we tried to appeal, more incidents appeared in his file. The department made sure of that." "Mrs. Holloway," Kendall said quietly, "there's something you should know." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "In Afghanistan, your husband saved my life. We were under heavy fire, and he got me out, carried me to safety despite his own injuries. That man they tried to paint as a troublemaker. He was a hero." Marjorie's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup. "They smeared him here while he was saving lives over there." "Yes, ma'am, and I intend to set that right." That evening, in her hotel room, Kendall sat surrounded by laptops and tablets, each screen showing different angles of the incident captured on phones. She methodically tagged timestamps, noting facial expressions, positions, and verbal exchanges. Her military training showed in the precise organization of her notes. She forwarded selected clips to Marshall Sutter and attorney Nia Brooks, a civil rights lawyer known for taking on systemic abuse. Each file was accompanied by detailed annotations, building a foundation for legal action. Her phone rang just as she finished reviewing the last video. The caller ID showed Marshall Sutter's number. "General," Sutter's voice was tight with controlled anger. "The department just released a statement. They're calling it a miscommunication during a high-stress situation." Kendall's jaw clenched. "Of course they are. There's more. My contact at the department says they're already working to have the civilian footage declared inadmissible. Something about privacy concerns at a military ceremony." Kendall glanced at her screen where Tate's hate-filled face was frozen in high definition, his gun aimed at her heart while mourners fled in terror. The machinery of cover-up was already in motion, its gears greased by years of practice. The afternoon sun beat down on the police station's concrete steps as Chief Wallace Keene adjusted his tie, standing before a forest of microphones. Mayor Trent Hargrove lounged beside him with the practiced ease of a career politician, his smile fixed and unnaturally serene. "The department takes any use of force seriously," Keene began, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who delivered too many similar speeches. Officer Tate responded to what he perceived as a potential threat to public safety during an emotionally charged situation. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as reporters jostled for position. The mayor nodded along, his expensive suit gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "Let's be clear," Hargrove added, stepping forward with practiced concern. "While we respect military service, appearing in full-dress uniform at a civilian funeral could be seen as intimidating. General Holloway's presence may have unnecessarily escalated tensions in our peaceful community." Inside the station's lobby, Kendall stood at the front desk, her spine straight as a ruler, while a young officer fumbled with complaint forms. His movements were deliberately slow, each paper seeming to require multiple checks and double checks. "Sorry, ma'am," he drawled, not looking sorry at all. "System's running slow today. Might take a while to process everything." Kendall watched as he accidentally dropped her completed forms behind the desk, then made a show of searching for them. When they reappeared, coffee stains marked several crucial sections. "Looks like you'll need to fill these out again," he said, pushing fresh forms across the desk with a smirk. Outside, the situation was deteriorating. A group of local men had gathered, their faces twisted with ugly intent as they harassed the small cluster of church members who'd come to support Marjorie. Deacon Ruth Caldwell, her silver hair gleaming in the sun, stood protectively beside the widow. "Go on home," one man sneered, stepping too close. "Ain't your kind welcome here." Ruth's voice rang out, clear and strong despite her years. "We have every right to be here. This is our town, too." The man's response was a sharp shove that sent Ruth stumbling backward. She fell hard on the concrete, her purse spilling open. Marjorie rushed to help her up as Sergeant Navarro's muscles tensed, his fists clenching. Kendall's hand landed firmly on Navarro's shoulder before he could move. "Stand down, Sergeant," she ordered quietly. "That's exactly what they want." Instead of engaging, Kendall pulled out her phone and began methodically documenting the scene. She noted license plate numbers, faces, and the careful inaction of the officers watching from the station door. Each detail was a piece of evidence. Each moment of selective enforcement another thread in the pattern she was uncovering. Later that evening, the fluorescent lights of a budget motel room cast harsh shadows across a table covered in witness statements and legal documents. Attorney Nia Brooks sat cross-legged in an uncomfortable chair, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through affidavits. Marshal Sutter leaned against the wall, her phone constantly buzzing with updates from federal contacts. "Look at this," Brooks said, pulling out a yellowed incident report. "The original complaint against Raymond Holloway filed years ago. Officer James Tate was the reporting officer." "Daniel Tate's father?" Kendall asked, though she already knew the answer. "The same," Brooks confirmed, spreading out more papers. "And here's the pattern. Every time Raymond was up for promotion or recognition, another complaint would appear, always from the same department, always with the same vague language about aggressive behavior and failure to comply." Sutter pushed off from the wall, her expression grim. "They're still using the same playbook. Did you see how they tried to paint you as the aggressor today?" Kendall nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of Raymond's service photo. "But they made a crucial mistake. This wasn't just any funeral. It was a military ceremony. Federal jurisdiction applies." Brooks straightened, suddenly alert. "The Honor and Respect Act. Any interference with a military funeral service is automatically a federal offense." Sutter finished, already reaching for her phone. "Give me an hour to contact the right people. If we file charges tonight..." The room hummed with purpose as they gathered their evidence. Kendall organized witness statements while Brooks drafted preliminary motions. Sutter paced by the window, having intense conversations with federal prosecutors. Outside, crickets chirped in the humid southern night. Car headlights occasionally swept across the motel's parking lot, reminding them that in a small town, every movement was watched. But tonight, that worked in their favor. Too many people had seen what happened at the funeral. Too many phones had recorded the truth. Sutter ended another call and turned to Kendall, her expression tight with controlled excitement. "Federal charges can land tonight if we move fast." The federal courthouse stood like a temple of justice, its marble columns reaching toward an overcast sky. Inside courtroom 3, the air crackled with tension as Officer Marcus Tate stood in handcuffs, his police uniform replaced by an ill-fitting suit that couldn't hide his restless anger. Behind the prosecution table, General Kendall Holloway sat ramrod straight, her gaze never wavering from the man who had pointed a gun at her chest. Attorney Nia Brooks moved with practiced precision, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the evidence table. "Your Honor, the people submit Exhibit A." She held up a phone, its screen connected to the courtroom's display system. Multiple angles of the incident captured by witnesses. The footage played in stark clarity. Tate's voice boomed through the speakers. "Get back, armed suspect." The video showed him breaking formation, shoving mourners aside, drawing his weapon while Kendall stood motionless, the folded flag still in her hands. "Note the timestamp," Brooks continued, freezing the frame. "Officer Tate drew his weapon before any verbal warning, before any attempt at identification, before any legitimate threat was established." Another video angle captured Tate slamming Sergeant Navarro to the ground, his boot grinding into the young veteran's shoulder. The impact echoed through the courtroom speakers, making several jurors flinch. "The defense claims confusion and split-second decisions," Brooks said, her voice steady. "The evidence shows premeditation and escalation." Tate's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Harrison, stood to object. "Your Honor, my client was responding to a potentially volatile situation. General Holloway's presence in full military dress could be interpreted as an aggressive display of force." Marshal Sutter took the stand next, her federal badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I was present in an official capacity," she testified. "Officer Tate ignored direct federal authority when ordered to stand down. He maintained his weapon stance despite clear identification of General Holloway's rank and purpose." "And how would you characterize his response to orders?" Brooks asked. "Defiant. Hostile." Sutter's eyes narrowed. He was more interested in maintaining control through intimidation than following lawful commands. The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair, studied a file before her. "The court has reviewed sealed records provided by the federal investigation. Officer Tate has multiple prior complaints of excessive force, all buried by local authorities." She looked up, her expression hardening. "Bond is denied." Tate's face flushed red, his shoulders tensed like a coiled spring. "This is ridiculous," he exploded, lurching forward. "That uniform doesn't make you better than me." He barely made it 2 steps before federal marshals moved. They slammed him face down onto the defense table, files scattering as they secured his arms behind his back. The sound of his cheek hitting wood echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Add contempt to the charges, the judge ordered, unfazed. This court finds the defendant's actions constitute armed intimidation at a federally protected military ceremony. Under the Military Honors Protection Act, this qualifies for domestic terror enhancements. Harrison jumped to his feet. Your Honor, those guidelines are extreme for pointing a loaded weapon at a United States general during a military funeral. The judge's voice could have frozen flame. The guidelines are quite clear. The mandatory minimum applies. She turned to Tate, who was now restrained between two marshals, a red mark blooming on his cheekbone. Marcus James Tate, this court sentences you to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The gallery erupted in whispers. Marjorie Holloway pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks. Sergeant Navarro, seated in the front row, unconsciously rubbed his still bruised shoulder. Tate thrashed against the marshal's grip. You can't do this. You can't. I'm a police officer. Not anymore, one of the marshals growled, tightening his grip. Kendall remained seated, her posture perfect, watching the scene unfold with the same tactical focus she'd used on battlefields. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her eyes tracked every detail. The other officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the mayor's empty chair in the gallery, the reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks. Marjorie leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. Is it really over? Kendall turned to the widow, noting the hope and fear warring in her eyes, the same eyes that had watched her husband's reputation destroyed decades ago by the same corrupt system. This is only the first wall to fall. The evening brought a heavy stillness to Marjorie's neighborhood. Street lights cast long shadows across well-kept lawns, their amber glow doing little to dispel the growing unease. Kendall's military-trained eyes tracked every detail as she pulled into the driveway. The unfamiliar black pickup truck idling 2 houses down, its headlights off but engine running. The unusual number of parked cars lining the street. The way certain shadows seemed to shift between the houses. She stepped out of her car, her dress uniform replaced by civilian clothes, though her bearing remained unmistakably military. The porch lights flickered, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made threat assessment more difficult. Marjorie's home, a modest 2-story with white trim and carefully tended flower beds, suddenly felt exposed. The first shout came from behind a hedge. Traitors! Then another. You got our boy locked up. They emerged from the darkness like wolves. A dozen men in work clothes and hunting jackets, some wearing caps pulled low over their faces. They spread out along the property line, beer bottles glinting in their hands. Mrs. Holloway, Kendall called calmly through the screen door. Please stay inside. Sergeant Navarro appeared on the porch, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. General, we should call the police. Already did, she replied, noting how the group was positioning themselves, not random but coordinated. These weren't just angry locals. Someone had organized this. A bottle shattered against the mailbox. Another crashed through Marjorie's front window, sending glass spraying across her living room floor. The widow's startled cry pierced the night. That's what you get, someone shouted. Should have kept your mouth shut. Navarro's training kicked in. He moved to protect the house's entrance, but 3 men rushed him from different angles. The first punch caught him in the ribs. As he staggered, the others pounced, driving him to his knees. A 4th man held up a phone, recording everything. Come on, General, the cameraman taunted. Show us what you're going to do about it. Kendall assessed the situation with combat-honed precision. The attackers wanted her to react emotionally, to give them footage they could use to paint her as the aggressor. She moved with controlled purpose instead. The man with the crowbar never saw her coming. One moment he was advancing, weapon raised. The next his wrist was locked in an expert hold that sent the metal bar clattering to the ground. She used his momentum against him, redirecting his force to send him sprawling. A second attacker rushed her. Kendall stepped inside his wild punch, applied pressure to key joints, and dropped him without throwing a single strike. The man howled in pain, but couldn't break her grip. Sergeant, on your feet, she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Navarro fought his way up, blood trickling from his nose, but his eyes clear. Together, they created a corridor back to the house. Deacon Ruth Caldwell appeared in the doorway, her aged frame somehow filling the space with authority. Everyone inside now, she ordered, ushering them through while fixing the mob with a stern gaze that made several men look away in shame. Police sirens wailed in the distance, deliberately late. Deputy Harold Puitt arrived first, taking his time getting out of his cruiser. He flipped open his notebook with exaggerated casualness. Looks like a disturbance, he drawled as if discussing the weather. Anyone get a good look at these folks? Kendall pointed to the fallen crowbar, now tagged with evidence markers that had fingerprints. The security camera caught clear faces. Several witnesses can identify. Well, now, Pruitt interrupted. That's going to be hard to prove. Dark night like this, emotions running high. He smiled blandly. Could have been anybody. Kendall's phone buzzed. Nia Brooks calling. She stepped aside to answer while watching Pruitt pretend to investigate. They're moving fast, Nia reported. Tate's lawyer is filing an appeal claiming prejudicial treatment. Two witnesses have already called, saying they're getting pressure to change their statements. Someone's coordinating this. Through the crowd of milling officers, Kendall spotted Chief Keene's distinctive patrol car parked at the end of the block. It had been there before the attack, she realized. Watching, waiting, not preventing. We need more, she told Nia. Hard evidence linking Hargrove, Keene, and the department. Something they can't bury. I'm already working on warrants, Nia replied. But be careful, they're getting desperate. Kendall ended the call and moved into the yard, scanning the shadows with practiced efficiency. Movement caught her eye. A small red dot appearing on the fence, tracking slowly across the white paint like a hunter's sight. The late afternoon sun slanted through the Venetian blinds in Attorney Nia Brooks's office, casting striped shadows across the worn carpet. Kendall sat perfectly still, her posture military straight despite the comfortable chair, as she watched Elaine Mercer's trembling hands clutch a battered cardboard box. I've kept these hidden, Mercer whispered, her voice thin with fear. In my attic, behind the Christmas decorations. She pulled out stack after stack of yellowed papers, radio logs spanning decades of police dispatches. Nobody thinks about the dispatcher. We're just voices on the radio, but we hear everything. Kendall leaned forward, her movements careful and controlled. Tell me about the funeral day, Mrs. Mercer. There was no call. Mercer's fingers traced the printed lines. No armed suspect report, nothing. I was on duty. Officer Tate never received any notification about a threat. She pulled out a specific log dated the day of Raymond's funeral. See? Every call, every response, every unit movement. Nothing about suspicious activity near the cemetery. Nia Brooks made notes, her pen scratching quietly. And you're certain about this? I've been dispatching for years, Mercer said, straightening despite her fear. I know what calls exist and what don't, but it's more than that. She started sorting through older logs. I've watched them do this before. Black motorist gets stopped. Suddenly, there's a call about a robbery suspect in the area. Black kids in the park. Somebody reported suspicious behavior. The calls appear after the fact, justify what's already been done. Kendall stood, moving to check the parking lot through the blinds. Her combat instincts kicked in, monitoring exits, identifying vehicles, noting vantage points. Your phone, Mrs. Mercer. The dispatcher handed over her cell phone. Kendall powered it off completely, removed the battery. They can track these, she explained quietly. We'll get you a burner phone. I never thought, Mercer's voice cracked. All these years I kept quiet, told myself it wasn't my place. But watching what happened at that funeral, seeing that gun pointed at you, I can't stay silent anymore. Nia spread the logs across her desk, photographing each page. This is excellent documentation, Mrs. Mercer. But we need to move carefully. The department will claim these are fabricated or stolen. They're authentic, Mercer insisted. Every log has timestamps, dispatch codes, officer badge numbers, and I'm not the only one who knows. Other dispatchers, they've seen the pattern too. They're just scared. Kendall mapped out the situation like a tactical problem. We need to get you home safely, not the way you came. She sketched a quick route on a notepad. Take these back streets. Watch your mirror. If anyone follows, drive straight to the Federal Building downtown. I never thought retirement would feel like going undercover. Mercer attempted a weak joke, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Nia was already drafting paperwork. I'm requesting federal witness protection, but bureaucracy takes time and we need to file this testimony while the appeal is still active. How long? Kendall asked. Days, maybe weeks. Depends on how many strings they pull to slow it down. Nia glanced up. Meanwhile, they're working the other angle. As if on cue, Kendall's phone buzzed with texts from Marjorie. The mayor's office had been busy. Rumors spreading through church groups, whispered conversations at grocery stores, pointed comments at bridge clubs. Kendall was an outsider, they said, stirring up trouble in a peaceful town. Elderly church members received anonymous calls reminding them how their pensions could be affected by community instability. Classic isolation tactics, Kendall observed. Divide the community, make supporters feel vulnerable. They're good at it, Mercer agreed. Been practicing for years. They spent the next hour preparing Mercer for her testimony. Kendall coached her like training a soldier. Stay focused on facts. Don't let emotion drive the narrative. Maintain precise details. They'll try to rattle you, make you doubt your memory. But you've got something they don't expect. Documentation. Let the logs speak for themselves. I can do this, Mercer said, squaring her shoulders, for all the times I should have spoken up before. As they prepared to leave, Kendall caught movement in the parking lot. Deputy Harold Pruitt sat in his cruiser pretending to check his phone while actually photographing Mercer's car with a long lens camera. Without changing expression, Kendall positioned her own phone, recording Pruitt's surveillance through the window. Mercer gripped Kendall's sleeve, her fingers digging in with unexpected strength. They kill memories here, she whispered, eyes wide with genuine fear. They make truth disappear until nobody remembers what really happened. Dusk painted the sky in deepening shades of purple as Kendall guided her sedan through the back streets of town. Her eyes constantly scanned mirrors, intersections, shadowed driveways. Beside her, Elaine Mercer clutched her purse tight against her chest, the radio logs safely hidden inside. Almost home, Kendall assured her, taking another careful turn onto a residential street lined with towering oak trees. The route deliberately avoided main roads and traffic cameras that might track their movement. In the rearview mirror, headlights appeared. Kendall's jaw tightened as she watched the vehicle close the distance with deliberate speed. Mrs. Mercer, hold on to something. The impact came hard, metal crunching against metal as the pursuing vehicle slammed into their rear bumper. Mercer screamed, but Kendall's hands remained steady on the wheel. She tapped the brakes, creating space, then accelerated through the swerve as their attacker tried to push them sideways. Stay calm, Kendall commanded, her voice carrying the authority of countless combat situations. She positioned the car defensively, using the full width of the road to prevent the other vehicle from getting alongside them. Another ram came harder this time. Kendall felt the rear wheels losing traction. Instead of fighting it, she used the momentum, guiding their slide onto the gravel shoulder. Stones pinged against the undercarriage as she fought for control, compensating for the loose surface with precise steering inputs. The pursuing vehicle cut sharply in front of them, forcing Kendall to brake hard. They skidded to a stop near an empty lot overgrown with weeds. Three men emerged from the other car, local faces Kendall recognized from the crowd at Marjorie's house. The first gripped a length of heavy chain, swinging it in lazy circles. The second wore brass knuckles that gleamed dully in the fading light. The third flicked open a switchblade, the sound sharp in the evening quiet. Get the old lady, Chainman growled. Make sure she understands about keeping quiet. Kendall's mind shifted fully into combat mode, analyzing threats and calculating angles. As they approached, she stepped away from the car, drawing their attention. Mrs. Mercer, stay inside. Lock the doors. Knife Man lunged first, blade slashing in a wide arc. Kendall caught his wrist and slammed it against the car door frame with crushing force. Bone cracked. She didn't pause. Using his momentum, she smashed his head against the door edge once, twice, 3 times until his eyes rolled back and he crumpled. Chainman swung his weapon in a whistling arc. Kendall ducked under it, stepped inside his guard, and swept his legs with a precise kick. As he fell, she followed him down, pinning him with her knee. Her hands moved with surgical precision. Grip, twist, pull. His shoulder dislocated with an audible pop, and his scream echoed off nearby houses. The third attacker tried to circle around toward Mercer's door. Kendall intercepted him, driving her forearm into his throat with enough force to collapse his windpipe. As he gasped, she snapped her elbow up into his nose. Cartilage crunched, blood sprayed, and he stumbled backward, clutching his face. Get in the car, Kendall ordered Mercer, who had watched the violence with wide, shocked eyes. Now! They peeled out, leaving the 3 men groaning on the ground. Kendall drove precisely despite her elevated heart rate, checking mirrors constantly for additional pursuit. She had been careful, brutal, but controlled, causing enough damage to disable without crossing into lethal force. Every injury could be justified as necessary defensive action. 10 minutes later, they pulled into a brightly lit gas station. Security cameras covered the lot, and a steady stream of customers meant witnesses. Kendall positioned their vehicle where it could be clearly seen, then pulled out her phone to call Marshal Sutter. They're hunting witnesses, she reported crisply. I have proof. She glanced at Mercer, who had finally stopped shaking. 3 attackers, all previously seen at the demonstration outside Marjorie's house. They specifically targeted Mrs. Mercer. I defended with appropriate force and can provide detailed descriptions. While waiting for Sutter's response, Kendall examined Mercer for any injuries. The dispatcher managed a weak smile. Years answering emergency calls, she said. Never thought I'd be making one. You did well, Kendall assured her. Stayed calm, followed instructions. She checked the radio logs in Mercer's purse. Still intact, still safely hidden. They're escalating because they're desperate. These logs terrify them. Blue and red lights appeared in the distance. Sutter had called in local deputies to document the scene. Kendall's lip curled slightly. She wondered how the report would read, how they would try to twist self-defense into aggression. But she had followed her training perfectly. Every move had been measured, necessary, and witnessed. Mercer touched her arm. Thank you, she whispered, for protecting me. Kendall nodded once, her posture military straight as she watched the patrol cars approach. That's what soldiers do, Mrs. Mercer. We protect people who stand up for the truth. Mercer huddled in a vinyl chair inside the makeshift safe room at the federal building, her fingers trembling as she clutched a paper cup of cold coffee. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, deepening the worry lines around her eyes. Kendall stood by the window, her phone held close as she studied the photos she'd captured earlier. Deputy Harold Puig's furtive surveillance, the distinct license plate of the vehicle that had attacked them. I've seen that truck before, Mercer whispered, her voice thin with exhaustion. Parked behind the station some nights when I worked late shifts. Kendall nodded, cataloging the detail with military precision. She'd spent hours documenting every angle, every connection, building a web of evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. The image of Puig showed him clearly. Badge visible, department vehicle in frame, timestamp intact, perfect documentation of coordinated harassment. Marshal Sutter paced the small room, phone pressed to her ear as she argued with superiors about expedited protection orders. The bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, each delay increasing the risk. Kendall could read the frustration in Sutter's clipped responses and tight shoulders. Nia Brooks burst through the door, legal files clutched under one arm. Emergency motions filed, she announced, spreading documents across a metal table. One to block Tate's appeal attempt, another demanding immediate investigation into witness intimidation. Judge Warren's clerk promised to expedite, but it won't be fast enough. Kendall finished, her tone flat. She'd seen this pattern before. Justice delayed until truth could be buried. The night stretched long. They took detailed statements, photographed Mercer's injuries from the attack, and established protective protocols. Sutter arranged for overnight security while the paperwork processed. By dawn, Mercer looked hollow-eyed but determined, clutching her precious box of radio logs as she was escorted home. The call came 3 hours later. Kendall arrived at Mercer's small ranch house to find yellow police tape already strung across the front yard. Officers milled about with practiced solemnity while Chief Keene held court near a cluster of news vans, his voice carrying practiced grief. Tragic situation, signs of depression, note found, clearly overwhelmed. Kendall's military training screamed warnings as she approached the scene. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, but the welcome mat was slightly askew. Inside, the staged tableau felt wrong. A kitchen chair tipped at an unnatural angle, drag marks partially hidden by a hastily straightened rug. She moved closer, ignoring the glares from local officers. Mercer's body had already been removed, but evidence remained for those who knew where to look. A broken fingernail caught in the chair's wooden slats, a torn sleeve from Mercer's cardigan, the fabric stretched in a way that suggested struggle rather than fall. And there, almost hidden by shadow, faint bruising patterns around the doorframe at waist height, consistent with someone being held in place. Ma'am, this is an active investigation area, an officer tried to block her path. Federal jurisdiction, Kendall replied coldly, holding up her phone to document the scene. Each photo captured deliberate details: the unnatural chair position, the subtle signs of staging, the rushed cleanup barely hidden beneath official procedure. Outside, Deacon Ruth Caldwell tried to push past the police line, her voice cracking with grief and anger. Let me see her. She was my friend for years. Officers pushed her back as Mayor Hargrove approached reporters, his face arranged in concerned furrows. Such a sad situation, he murmured, shaking his head. Mental health resources are so important in these trying times. Kendall felt something crack in her carefully maintained composure. For one breath, raw fury leaked through her professional mask. Fury at the casual cruelty, at the machinery of corruption that could snuff out truth with such calculated efficiency. Then her expression hardened into something darker, more focused. She continued photographing methodically, logging each officer's name and position, noting every procedural shortcut. Marshal Sutter arrived, taking in the scene with narrowed eyes. Kendall pulled her aside, pointing out the county coroner's suspiciously quick pronouncement of suicide. The body removed before federal examination could be arranged. The evidence degrading by the minute. Nia joined them, her legal pad already filled with rapid notes. Without Mercer's testimony, Tate's people will argue he was politically sentenced. They'll push for appeal on grounds of prejudicial treatment. Then we shift focus, Kendall replied, her voice carrying steel. We prove the machine, not the man. Every connection, every cover-up, every piece of this system that protects killers and silences truth. She gestured at the staged scene. This wasn't one corrupt cop. This was coordination. Chief Keene's voice drifted across the yard as he spoke to a junior officer, just quiet enough to seem private, but clear enough to carry. Clean it up before the feds get brave. The fluorescent lights in room 114 of the Pine Tree Motel buzzed faintly as Kendall studied the evidence wall they'd assembled. Photos, documents, and sticky notes covered nearly every inch of the faded wallpaper, connected by red string that traced paths of corruption through the small town's power structure. Marshal Sutter stood beside her, arms crossed, while attorney Nia Brooks sat at the small table, legal papers spread before her. The air conditioning unit rattled in the window, barely cutting through the humid evening air. Tate was just the triggerman, Kendall said, her finger tracing a line between photos. The real target is the system that gave him a loaded gun and promised to clean up his messes. Nia nodded, shuffling through a stack of partially redacted complaints. 15 brutality reports in 3 years, all sealed by internal affairs. That's not individual corruption, that's institutional protection. A knock at the door made them pause. Sutter's hand moved to her weapon until Kendall recognized Sergeant Navarro's pattern. 2 quick taps. Pause. 1 more. She opened the door to find him slightly out of breath, excitement visible beneath his usual military discipline. "Ma'am, I found something," he said, stepping inside. "Former city IT contractor named Elliot Vance. He's willing to talk, but he's scared. Says the department keeps a shadow server system off the books." "Location?" Kendall asked, already reaching for her notebook. He wouldn't say over the phone. "Wants protection guarantees first." Navarro hesitated. "He sounded pretty spooked, ma'am." 20 minutes later, they met Vance in the back booth of a 24-hour diner just outside town limits. He was younger than Kendall expected, early 40s, with nervous hands that couldn't stay still. His eyes darted between exits as he spoke in hushed tones. "I helped set it up years ago," he explained, shredding a paper napkin. "Separate network, no connection to official systems. They said it was for administrative backup, but I saw what they stored there. Complaint records, body cam footage, internal investigations that never made it to official channels." "Where?" Kendall asked quietly, her presence calm and steady against his anxiety. "I can't. If they find out I talked..." His voice cracked. Kendall leaned forward slightly, not crowding him, but ensuring he met her eyes. "Mr. Vance, I understand your fear. But right now, an innocent woman is dead because she tried to tell the truth. If we don't stop this, there will be more deaths, more cover-ups, more families destroyed while good people stay quiet." Her words carried no threat, just the weight of absolute certainty. Vance's fingers stopped moving. "There's an old evidence annex behind the station," he finally said. "Looks abandoned from the outside, but they renovated the basement. Climate control, backup power, everything needed for long-term data storage." Nia's pen moved quickly across her legal pad while Sutter typed notes into her phone. Kendall kept her attention on Vance, reading the fear and guilt in his posture. "I'll need you to document everything you know about the system," she said. "In return, we'll ensure federal witness protection." Later that night, Kendall positioned herself in an empty office building overlooking the police station's rear parking lot. Her camera's night vision captured clear images of officers moving in and out of the supposedly abandoned annex, carrying boxes and equipment. "Got movement," she whispered into her radio. Sutter and Navarro were stationed in vehicles nearby, documenting from different angles. Through her camera's lens, she watched Chief Keene arrive in an unmarked car, checking surroundings before unlocking the annex door. Deputy Harold Pruitt followed minutes later, emerging with what looked like external hard drives. "Follow Pruitt," she instructed Navarro carefully. The next hour revealed a pattern. Pruitt making multiple trips between the annex and Mayor Hargrove's parked car 3 blocks away. Each time hard drives went in, but nothing came out. "They're copying files before destroying originals," Nia said through the radio. "Classic obstruction pattern." "We have it all documented," Kendall confirmed, reviewing the footage. "Multiple officers, department leadership, elected officials, conspiracy to obstruct justice and destroy evidence in a federal civil rights investigation." Sutter's voice crackled over the radio. "Judge Warren is standing by. One more solid link and we can get emergency warrants for immediate seizure." As if on cue, Pui appeared again, this time carrying a laptop clearly marked with police department inventory tags. The camera caught perfect frames of him transferring it to Hargrove's vehicle. "There's our probable cause," Nia said, "sending the warrant request now." Kendall continued filming as Pui returned to the annex. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for the judge's response. Finally, Sutter's radio crackled. "Warrant approved. Federal tactical units are minutes out." Through her lens, Kendall saw the lights inside the station suddenly go dark. Emergency vehicles appeared at both ends of the street, sirens wailing as they converged on the building. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the police station like a shroud. Kendall stood beside a federal surveillance van, her shoulders straight and her breathing steady as she watched tactical teams take position. Nia Brooks clutched a thick folder of warrants while Marshal Sutter coordinated with her strike teams through a secure radio. "Alpha team in position at the station," crackled a voice through the radio. "Bravo standing by at the evidence annex. Charlie and Delta confirming visual on both Hargrove's office and Keene's residence." "Execute on my mark," Sutter replied, checking her watch. "Synchronize for simultaneous entry in 3, 2, 1, execute. The quiet morning erupted into controlled chaos. Federal agents in tactical gear breached all 4 locations at once. At the station, officers scrambled to block doorways and deny access, but the warrant's authority was absolute. Through her binoculars, Kendall watched them trying to stall, reaching for phones that had already been cut off. Station secure, the team leader reported. Multiple officers attempting to obstruct were logging names and badges. Inside the evidence annex, agents found exactly what Vance had described. The basement hummed with servers, their cooling fans spinning at maximum speed as someone tried desperately to wipe data. A federal tech specialist shouldered past a protesting sergeant and took control of the system. Got it, the tech announced over the radio. Caught at mid-deletion, beginning recovery protocols now. Kendall's attention shifted to Hargrove's office, where agents were discovering the true scope of the corruption. Behind a false panel in his desk, they found encrypted hard drives and a leather-bound ledger. The book's neat columns detailed what they called detention incentives, kickbacks from a private prison contractor based on arrest quotas and length of sentences. Ma'am, called one agent, holding up the ledger. This goes back years. Thousands of cases potentially compromised. Chief Keene didn't even make it to his car. Federal agents intercepted him, trying to slip out through the station's rear emergency exit. A laptop clutched under his arm. The chief's usual polished demeanor cracked as they cuffed him, his face flushed with rage and fear. "This is a mistake," he blustered. "I demand to speak to my attorney." "Your attorney can meet you at the federal courthouse," Sutter replied coldly. Deputy Harold Pewitt proved to be the weakest link in the chain of corruption. As soon as he saw Keene in handcuffs, his courage evaporated. He practically ran to the federal agents, desperate to save himself. "I want a deal," he stammered, eyes wild. "I'll tell you everything about Mercer, about the ambush. It wasn't my idea. I was following orders." Kendall stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of command. "Every word goes on record. Proper deposition signed and witnessed. No backroom arrangements that can disappear." Puit nodded frantically. "They told me to watch Mercer, take photos, report her movements. When that didn't scare her enough, Keene ordered me to set up the road attack. Said to make it look random, but send a message." Sergeant Navarro stood nearby, his jaw tight as he watched the proceedings. The bruises from his own encounter with the department's violence were still visible, but there was satisfaction in his eyes as he watched the corrupt officers being led away in handcuffs. The sun began to rise over the small town as federal agents continued their methodical sweep, evidence bags filled with documents and devices. Officers who had lorded their power over the community just yesterday now sat subdued in custody, their badges and weapons confiscated. In Keene's office, agents discovered a hidden safe containing decades of buried complaint files. Each manila folder represented a life damaged or destroyed by systemic abuse. Raymond Holloway's falsified disciplinary record was just one among hundreds. The tech team working on the shadow server called Sutter over. "Ma'am, we've recovered a significant portion of the deleted data so far. It's worse than we thought. They kept detailed records of every cover-up, probably as insurance against each other." Kendall watched the scene with the same tactical focus she'd used on military operations. Every piece of evidence was a position secured. Every confession, another strategic objective achieved. The machine that had protected Tate and countless others was being dismantled gear by gear. Near the evidence annex, a group of early rising citizens had gathered to watch. Among them, Kendall recognized faces from Raymond's funeral, the elderly church members who'd been shoved aside, the young veterans who'd been helpless to intervene. Now they watched in silent witness as justice finally arrived in their town. Sutter stepped up beside Kendall, holstering her weapon. "We have the machine's heart," she said. "Now we make it beat in court." The federal evidence lab hummed with the sound of multiple computers processing data. The stark fluorescent lighting cast a clinical glow over Kendall, Sutter, and Nia as they stood before a large monitor, their faces reflecting the blue light of the loading screen. "File recovery complete," announced the tech specialist, stepping back from the keyboard. "This is the original uncompressed body cam footage from Officer Tate." The video began to play. The image quality was crystal clear, far different from the grainy, corrupted version the department had initially provided. They watched as Tate approached the funeral gathering, his movements deliberate and predatory. The audio picked up his breathing, steady and controlled, not the panicked gasps of someone who felt threatened. "There," Nia pointed. Just before Tate broke formation, his lips curled into an unmistakable smirk. The camera caught his hand moving to his weapon before any perceived threat could have existed. The footage continued, showing the brutal efficiency with which Tate struck Navarro. The young sergeant's ceremonial program scattered across the grass as he fell. The camera's microphone caught the sound of Tate's boot grinding into Navarro's shoulder, along with a muttered racial slur that had been conveniently missing from the doctored version. "Look at the timestamp," Sutter noted, her finger tracing the numbers at the bottom of the screen. "He held his weapon on the general for nearly 2 minutes after I gave the order to stand down." More files populated the screen as the tech continued the recovery process. Years of traffic stops appeared in neat rows, each one tagged with racial identifiers and notes about strategic enforcement zones that somehow always centered on minority neighborhoods. These reports, Naya said, spreading printouts across a nearby table, the language is too similar. They were using templates to justify probable cause. She held up two documents dated years apart. Same paragraph, word for word, just different names. A series of emails between Chief Keene and Mayor Hargrove filled the next screen. The messages were casual, almost cheerful, as they discussed keeping the numbers up and meeting quotas. One particularly damning exchange detailed their system for selecting which complaints to bury and which officers to protect. The financial analyst assigned to the case called them over to another workstation. We've traced the kickback scheme, she explained, pulling up spreadsheets and bank records. They laundered it through a nonprofit called Community Safety Partners, monthly deposits coinciding with prisoner transfers to private facilities. Nia began organizing the evidence into categories, her legal mind already crafting the framework for multiple indictments: obstruction of justice, conspiracy against rights, witness intimidation. She paused, looking at a particularly detailed financial record, and wire fraud, federal charges, all of them. Kendall studied the crime scene photos from Mercer's house, her military training catching details others might miss. The angle of the chair, the pattern of bruises, the torn sleeve, all inconsistent with suicide. She placed Puit's sworn confession beside the photos. He gave us everything, Sutter confirmed. Names, dates, locations, who ordered what, who covered which tracks. A secretary interrupted them with a message. Hargrove's attorney was offering a deal. The mayor would plead to lesser charges in exchange for limiting the scope of the investigation. Nia didn't even look up from her work as she refused. They don't get to bargain their way out of this one, she said firmly. Not after Mercer. Kendall gathered the most crucial documents, the ones that would finally clear Raymond's name. The falsified disciplinary record that had denied him full honors could now be proven as deliberate harassment. His service record would be restored, his decorations acknowledged, his widow properly compensated. She drove to Marjorie's house, where the widow sat in her living room, surrounded by old photos of Raymond in uniform. Kendall laid out the evidence carefully, explaining each document's significance. It won't just be headlines and speeches, Kendall assured her, pointing to the official letterhead of various federal agencies. Everything will be corrected in writing, permanently. Raymond's record will reflect the truth of his service. Back at the evidence lab, Kendall stood before the monitor one final time. She signed her name to a detailed affidavit, her signature as precise and controlled as every other action she'd taken since the funeral. Looking up at the screen where Tate's body cam footage played on loop, she observed the perfect irony. They filmed their own downfall. The tech continued to extract more files, each one adding another layer to the conspiracy. Detailed logs revealed how evidence had been routinely altered, how witness statements had been lost, how officers had been trained to manipulate their cameras. The scope of corruption was breathtaking in its thoroughness. The federal courthouse's video screen flickered to life, revealing Tate's face from the maximum security prison. Fresh bruises mottled his jaw and cheek from where marshals had subdued him during his previous outburst. His orange jumpsuit stood in stark contrast to the institutional gray walls behind him, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, burning with unconcealed hatred as he stared directly at Kendall. Judge Eleanor Matthews adjusted her glasses and addressed the court. We're here to consider the appeal of Marcus Tate versus the United States regarding sentencing in case number 2023CR789. You may proceed. Marcus Wheeler, Tate's new attorney, rose from his chair. His expensive suit and carefully styled hair suggested serious backing from somewhere. Your Honor, we contend that the sentencing was unduly harsh and politically motivated. This was a local police matter that never should have reached federal jurisdiction. Nia Brooks remained seated, her posture relaxed but alert. She'd anticipated this argument weeks ago and had prepared accordingly. When Wheeler finished his opening statement, she approached the podium with a thick folder. Your Honor, I'll address jurisdiction first. She began laying out documents on the presentation screen. This was a military honors ceremony, officially sanctioned by the Department of Defense. Federal Marshal Sutter was present in an official capacity. The moment Officer Tate drew his weapon, he elevated this from a local disturbance to a federal offense. Wheeler attempted to interrupt, but Nia continued smoothly. I have the ceremony authorization forms, Marshal Sutter's duty roster, and the military protocols that were in effect that day. She displayed each document in turn, her methodical presentation leaving no room for argument. The restored body cam footage played next. The clarity was startling. Every movement, every word crisp and undeniable. The court watched as Tate approached with his hand already moving toward his weapon, his smirk visible before any supposed threat emerged. When it was Kendall's turn to testify, she took the stand with military precision. Her dress uniform was immaculate, medals catching the courtroom lights. She didn't raise her voice or inject emotion into her account. I maintained parade rest position, arms visible, she stated, demonstrating the stance. When Officer Tate issued his first command, I verbally identified myself as a general officer of the United States Army. My hands remained in view at all times. She proceeded to break down each moment with tactical clarity, referring to specific training standards that defined threat escalation. According to standard law enforcement protocols, she continued, Officer Tate violated 7 distinct safety procedures in the first 30 seconds alone. His weapon was drawn without justification, aimed at center mass despite no hostile action, and maintained on target well after receiving a direct order from federal authority to stand down. Wheeler tried to paint Kendall's presence as provocative, but she countered with pure professionalism. I was there to present military honors to a decorated veteran's family. My role and authority were clearly established in advance through proper channels. Judge Matthews leaned forward as Nia presented the newly recovered evidence of departmental conspiracy. Emails, financial records, and internal memos scrolled across the screen, revealing the systematic corruption that had enabled Tate's behavior. The original sentence wasn't just appropriate, Judge Matthews declared, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Given this pattern of orchestrated civil rights violations, it was necessary to prevent further abuse of power. Tate's face contorted on the video screen. That town belongs to us, he shouted, spittle flying. You can't give away what's ours. We built it. We. The judge signaled and his microphone cut to silence, though they could still see him raging. Mr. Tate, she spoke firmly, your outburst only reinforces the court's position. This is precisely the attitude that makes you a continuing threat to public safety. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some held signs supporting Tate, their messages ugly with racial slurs and threats. As Marjorie emerged from the building, several protesters surged forward, screaming accusations about her husband's character. Sergeant Navarro moved instantly, positioning himself between the mob and Marjorie. Deacon Caldwell stepped up beside him, her aged frame straight and unflinching. Other community members joined them, forming a human chain of protection. Federal marshals pushed through, creating a corridor with their bodies. Back up, they commanded, forcing the protesters away from the steps. Several tried to break through, but were quickly detained. Judge Matthews's final ruling came down like a gavel stroke. The appeal is denied. Furthermore, I am ordering expanded investigations into all related cases involving the department during Mr. Tate's tenure. She fixed her gaze on the video screen where Tate had finally fallen silent. The life sentence stands, Mr. Tate, without possibility of parole. This court is adjourned. As the words settled over the courtroom, Kendall remained perfectly still, her face betraying nothing. The system that had protected Tate for so long had finally, irrevocably, turned against him. His life sentence was now sealed as tightly as the federal prison doors that would contain him until death. The courthouse hallway buzzed with whispers and camera clicks as U.S. Marshals led Mayor Hargrove and Chief Keene through the crowd. Their designer suits couldn't hide the stark reality of their steel handcuffs. Reporters thrust microphones forward while longtime supporters turned away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the ceiling tiles. Hargrove's carefully maintained political smile had crumbled into a gray mask of defeat. Beside him, Keene's jaw worked silently, his face flushed with humiliation as cameras captured every step. These were men who had commanded rooms with a glance, who had built careers on backroom deals and implied threats. Now they shuffled forward in prison-issued shoes, guided by the same federal authority they'd once mocked. Inside the courtroom, Nia Brooks stood before a gallery packed with townspeople, her evidence organized in devastating clarity on screens visible to all. The pattern is irrefutable, she declared, bringing up spreadsheet after spreadsheet. Arrest quotas tied directly to private prison contracts, traffic stops targeting specific neighborhoods, evidence tampering authorized at the highest levels. The numbers told their story. Black residents were 9 times more likely to face arrest, their cases fast-tracked through a system designed to feed the private detention center's profits. Each conviction meant kickbacks carefully hidden in fake consulting fees and inflated municipal contracts. Deputy Harold Pewitt sat in the witness box, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes that seemed to hang loose on his frame. His hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. Chief Keene gave me direct orders, he testified, voice cracking. Said to follow the dispatcher, Elaine Mercer, take photos, report her movements. The mayor, he swallowed hard. Mayor Hargrove said we needed to solve the general problem before she dug too deep. William Carlton, the private prison contractor's representative, sat stone-faced as federal agents detailed the money trail. Hargrove's Community Safety Foundation had received millions in anonymous donations. The ledger showed identical amounts moving through shell companies back to Carlton's firm, perfectly timed to match arrest spikes and contract renewals. Dr. Marcus Peterson, the county coroner, slumped in his chair as investigators dismantled his rushed ruling on Mercer's death. Crime scene photos showed defensive wounds he'd failed to document. Timestamps proved he'd signed the death certificate before basic toxicology results could possibly have returned. This wasn't incompetence, the federal prosecutor stated. This was deliberate obstruction to cover up a murder. The police department's implosion happened in waves. 3 council members resigned before lunch. By afternoon, 4 more followed. Department phones rang unanswered as officers called in sick, unwilling to face the crowds or wear badges that had become symbols of shame. The FBI's oversight team moved into empty offices, methodically downloading hard drives and copying personnel files. At the First Baptist Church Community Center, Kendall sat quietly as elderly residents stood one by one, sharing stories they'd held silent for decades. Missing evidence, convenient accidents, children arrested on trumped-up charges until they took plea deals. "My grandson," Mrs. Dorothy Williams said, her voice strong despite her years. "Straight A student. They planted drugs in his car during a school search. Judge gave him 5 years. Prison made him hard. He's never been the same." She fixed her gaze on Kendall. "But today, I can say it out loud. Today, somebody finally made them hear us." Marjorie sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling as she opened the official Department of Defense envelope. The letter inside was crisp, formal, and absolute. "Upon review of complete evidence, the record of Sergeant First Class Raymond Holloway is hereby amended to remove all disciplinary citations previously entered. His Silver Star commendation, temporarily suspended, is restored with full honors." The final sentencing hearing drew an overflow crowd. Keene stood first, shoulders hunched as the judge read his fate. 20 years federal time for conspiracy, civil rights violations, and accessory to witness tampering. His lawyers' attempts to cite his decades of service backfired. Each year in power only proved how long the corruption had festered. Hargrove rose next, his expensive legal team having failed to shield him from the evidence. The mayor, who had ruled through whispered threats, now faced the full weight of federal law. As the judge detailed his crimes, conspiracy, fraud, misuse of public funds, witness intimidation, his politician's mask finally cracked completely. These men had spent decades believing they owned justice, that they could bend it, shape it, use it as a weapon against those they deemed lesser. Now they watched helplessly as that same justice turned its unflinching gaze upon them. Their power, their control, their carefully constructed kingdom of fear, all of it crumbled under the simple weight of truth spoken aloud. Kendall observed it all from her seat beside Marjorie, her posture military straight, but her expression serene. She had faced their guns without flinching. Now she watched them face their consequences without mercy. The morning sun cast long shadows across Raymond Holloway's headstone as workers carefully secured the new bronze plaque. The polished metal caught the light, each engraved letter deep and permanent. No more erasure, no more lies. Marjorie stood straight-backed in her Sunday best, hands folded over the leather folder containing Raymond's restored military records. Gone were the hostile stares and circling patrol cars. No one watched the gathered mourners with suspicion or reached for weapons at the sight of uniforms. Instead, an honor guard stood at parade rest, their presence requested not to protect, but to honor. Kendall's dress uniform gleamed as she stepped forward, medals catching the sunlight. She'd earned each one honestly, just as Raymond had. The difference was that hers had been acknowledged, while his had been buried under decades of calculated prejudice. "This isn't about ceremony," Kendall said, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "This is about duty. The truth doesn't change based on who wants to hear it. Raymond Holloway served with distinction. He saved lives, including mine. That fact existed whether this town accepted it or not." Sergeant Navarro stood beside Deacon Caldwell. His bruises from the street attack faded, but still visible. The young soldier's eyes never stopped scanning the perimeter. Old habits died hard, but today there were no threats to guard against. The only sounds were birdsong and distant wind. Marjorie's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Inside lay the official documentation, every falsified charge expunged, every commendation restored. The Silver Star citation gleamed on heavy paper. Raymond's name and acts of valor recorded in permanent ink. She traced the words with her fingertip, as if ensuring they were real. "The Department of Defense acknowledges its failure to properly investigate the circumstances surrounding these honors," Kendall continued. "That failure ends today. Sergeant First Class Raymond Holloway's service record now reflects the truth it always contained." Federal Marshal Sutter stepped forward, her badge catching the morning light. "The police department remains under direct federal oversight," she reported. "New hiring procedures, mandatory bias training, and complete transparency requirements are non-negotiable. Every arrest record for the past years is being reviewed for similar patterns of abuse." Attorney Nia Brooks nodded, adding her own update. "The first wave of restitution payments begins next week. Anyone wrongfully arrested or convicted under the quota system will receive both compensation and legal assistance to clear their records. The private prison contractors' assets have been seized to fund additional damages." The honor guard raised their rifles. This time, no one flinched at the sound of the volleys. The sharp reports echoed across the cemetery, a soldier's tribute, pure and untainted by fear. Deacon Caldwell's deep voice led the gathered community in prayer, not for vengeance or retribution, but for healing, for the strength to rebuild trust where fear had ruled for so long. Marjorie stepped forward to lay fresh flowers by the headstone. The marble was cool beneath her fingers as she traced Raymond's name. Beside the dates of his birth and death, the new plaque told the truth. Decorated veteran, hero, savior of his fellow soldiers. Kendall waited until the others had stepped back before kneeling at the grave. Her voice dropped to a whisper meant only for Raymond's memory. "You saved my life in that valley," she murmured. "I couldn't save yours, but your funeral sparked something they couldn't stop. When Tate pulled that gun, he didn't just threaten me. He exposed every lie they'd built their power on. You saved me twice, Sergeant. Once with your courage, once with your memory." Miles away, in a federal maximum security facility, Officer Marcus Tate stood in his cell as the heavy door slammed shut. The sound echoed with crushing finality. Gone were his badge, his gun, his untouchable status. His world had shrunk to 8 by 10 feet of concrete and steel. No more small town kingdom. No more power to terrorize. No more system to protect him. Just endless days stretching into years, then decades until time itself became meaningless. Life without parole meant exactly that. His entire future contained within these walls. Back at the cemetery, Kendall rose and brushed grass from her knees. She joined Marjorie, their steps measured and unhurried as they walked away from the grave. Above them, the sky stretched clear and blue. No storms, no shadows, no lingering threats. They had not just hoped for justice or prayed for it. They had built it piece by piece, evidence by evidence, truth by truth. The machine that had protected Tate lay dismantled. The power structure that had buried Raymond's honor had been forced into the light. Together, they walked beneath that open sky, every step grounded in the knowledge that justice wasn't just a word anymore. It wasn't a promise or a dream or a distant hope. It was real. It was done. It was delivered. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.